Good. Good. We are going to have an exam on Wednesday. Development, motivation and emotion, and perception. Those will be the areas on the exam.
Is there a pencil sharpener, or do I have to go find one? I'm gonna go find one.
Suppose you had to write a 2,000-word essay. We do something different for a little while today. You have to write a 2,000-word essay on the following topic. Doorknob. Could you do it?
Yes.
2,000 words? We're going to come back to that.
Just as long as you don't give that to us for homework, I don't want to write any more papers.
2,000 words. You should be doing this in your English class.
Writing essays on doorknob?
Huh?
Writing essays on doorknob?
Yes?
We pretty much did this past week, which is
Yeah.
why I don't want to do another one right now.
Should. Doorknob. Fingernail.
Doorknobs are used in places like private businesses and homes,
No, it's
especially
just,
bathrooms.
it's just
Writing doorknobs. Right.
Without using an internet or with using the internet?
Without.
Yes, I can.
What if you don't know how to install a doorknob?
Then you can't write about it.
Process analysis?
Would you say write about it without using the word doorknob?
No,
without
using
using
the
the
internet. Internet, so you couldn't
Oh,
like look
yeah.
up how to install
Yeah.
a doorknob.
Yeah, no problem.
Alright. So basically it's like a process analysis essay.
We're going to talk about it. All right, we're coming back to it. We're coming back. We're going to return to that. There's any number of topics that we
With
could
the
use.
internet, yes.
We'll come back to that.
If they didn't have doorknobs, we have.
They have holes, it's
They said-
different.
Here we go. This very famous statement from William Blake. Anybody ever see it before? The doors of perception were cleansed, man would see everything as it is, infinite. Blake was an English poet. He's not one of our contemporaries, he's not around anymore, he lived a couple hundred years ago. But this is actually a very famous statement from Blake, from Blake's writing. Anyone know what it means? Interesting. Blake.
Possibilities are endless depending on how we look at something.
I understand. I'll come back to this too. Actually it relates to doorknobs. And not just because, right, he's talking about doors.
Wednesday.
When you look at this, and then when you look at it down here, the meaning changes, even though the words are the same, the meaning changes, yes? The way you interpret it changes. And then looking at these, when we look at this, it's much easier for us, in looking at this, to see 3 columns rather than 5 rows. Okay, we tend to see the verticals in this more readily than we see the horizontals. What's that word? Now you
I now believe that I can actually understand what
And I'm sure many of you have seen this, yes?
Yep.
Once you have context, then it becomes much easier. It's not just the first and last letter, by the way. The first and last letters aren't. They help, right? It helps, but the context is the biggest part of looking at this. We'll talk about all of these things, right, as well as some other stuff. When we left the last time, I was asking you about a perceptual illusion. I said, what if you see two solid objects, and these 2 solid objects begin changing shape, and then they start moving in and out of one another, and then they come back side by side. And even if you tell yourself again and again and again that this is an illusion, you're not really seeing it, it's difficult to see beyond it. And I asked you why that might be the case. What do we see? We see what we expect to see. We have expectations about the world. So you're likely thinking, well, I don't have any expectations about 2 solid objects or 2 pieces of steel changing shape and moving in and out of one another. But we do have expectations about the world. The world itself, how it looks, and how it works. Right? Those expectations we do have. Right? And those expectations that we have about the world another way of talking about them is to talk about them as cultural assumptions. Every culture on the planet, no matter how primitive, no matter how sophisticated, has explained that world out there that exists. Every single one. Right? What the world looks like, what it is, how we should interpret it. Through the process of socialization, we learn about the world. We learn about it. We learn what's there, we learn what to see. We can all look out the window and agree on everything that's out there. And these cultural assumptions, we use them all the time to make sense out of everything that happens around us. Everything. What we see, right? What we evaluate, an individual's behavior. There's so much a part of us that we really can't even imagine a world without them. Right? We internalize them, they become so much a part of our ways of knowing, seeing. And these cultural assumptions that we use for all sorts of things, to evaluate, to understand, to make a judgment about, it's very difficult for us to actually say what they are, even though they're so much a part of us. As when, like, you explain something to a child and, right, this is the way it goes and this is the way it is, and the child says to you, why? Or, how do you know? Very difficult to put it in words. But it's almost like, right, you want to say, that's a crazy question because this is just the way it goes. This is just the way it is. It couldn't be any other way, right? You couldn't imagine that it would be any different because of the way it is. Well, all of these things that we're talking about here, expectations, cultural assumptions, knowing about the world, it's our knowledge base, what we know. So tell me, is it possible to separate perception from knowledge? Does what you know about the world invariably shape what you see and how you see it? I mean, do we see the world as it is, or do we see the world the way we come to know the world? Does knowledge about the world, knowing what should be, make a difference in what we see and how we see? Of course it does. Right? It couldn't be any other way. Right? Knowledge about the world invariably shapes what we see in the world. So if we look out the window, right, we can agree on everything that's out there, the snow, the trees, the sidewalk, the road, the buildings. Let's say we're looking at the grass out there. Now, right? We can recognize the grass. Let's say we go outside and we look very closely at the grass. We can see the blades of grass. So we can see the blades. Right? We know that it's grass. We know these are the individual blades. Let's just say that there's a culture somewhere where instead of learning to look at the individual blades of grass, they learn to look at the spaces between the blades. Let's just say, hypothetically. Would the grass look different? Would they think about it differently? Would they use it differently? Here's an example of something. Colin Turnbull. Come back to Colin in a moment. He was an anthropologist. Tells of the time he took Pygmy from the dense rainforests of Africa to the vast African plains. The Pygmy had never before seen objects at great distance. Hence, the first time he saw a herd of buffalo in the distance, he thought it was a swarm of insects. Imagine his confusion when he was driven toward the animals. He concluded that he was being fooled by witchcraft because the insects seemed to grow into buffalo before his eyes. Right? If you were riding in the car with this native, right, or actually it was a Jeep. Turnbull had the guy in the Jeep. And I'll tell you about Turnbull in a moment. But if you were riding, right, in the Jeep with this native, you both would be looking at exactly the same thing, but seeing and understanding and interpreting two very different things based on your knowledge base. The objective event would be exactly the same, but what you see would be different. Now, for us, I mean, this is an example that's very contrary to our own experience. Right? But what about somebody who doesn't have the same experience? It doesn't come from the same underlying set of assumptions about the world. Turnbull was an anthropologist. And Turnbull was around like 30s, 40s, 50s. That's primarily when he was around, a while ago. And what Turnbull did is Turnbull made it his life's work to identify cultures that were radically different from our own. Cultures that operated on completely different sets of premises about the world. They understood the world, themselves, everything around them differently than we did. So Turnbull's writings are filled with accounts just like this, where our understanding of something, or what we know to be the case, is not what somebody else is going to know or understand to be the case, or see. I mean, Turnbull, back in the 30s, 40s, and even the 50s, it was possible to identify remote regions of the world where groups of people were pretty isolated. They didn't know about bicycles, they didn't know about telephones, they didn't know about cars, where they lived with stone tools. Some of these groups of people had never before seen a white person. So could you imagine a white person, an anthropologist, coming down in like a helicopter?
In glasses.
Yeah, glasses, driving out of the woods in a Jeep?
He's a god or a demon.
That's exactly right. I mean, they didn't know. and Turnbull, the way in which you learn about people, it's not like you swing by for an afternoon. Turnbull lived with these groups for months and months and months to learn their ways of seeing, thinking, understanding. Anyway, different culture, different knowledge base, and what's this guy's knowledge base? He doesn't understand exactly what he's looking at, but he knows that something happened. He doesn't understand why it's happened. He lives in a dense rainforest. So what's it like in a dense rainforest? What's going to be his experience with things like distance and depth? It's going to be close, and it's not going to be your experience. Certainly, if he's not been in moving vehicles, which we have countless experiences with. We don't even think about things like this. But for someone without any experience of it, well, what would it be like? Let's say that here we are sitting in this room. You've got people sitting next to you, in front of you. So if you look at somebody sitting close to you, they're sitting in front, they're sitting on the side, the image that hits your retina from somebody sitting close, that's one image that hits your retina. What if there was someone outside 300 yards away? A very different image hits your retina if the person is 300 yards away. Now the image hitting your retina is only this big. Somebody sitting close by, right? The image that's hitting your retina is different than the image, right? Yet, right? You understand exactly what you're looking at. Right? You know that the person sitting next to you and the person 300 yards away, right, may not be vastly different sizes. You don't think you're looking at somebody that's this big. What would it be like, however, if someone were blind since birth? Let's say they're 52 years old and they're blind since birth. Right? And they live for 52 years without sight. And then all of a sudden, an operation gives them sight. They have vision after 52 years. And they're right here in this room. Right? And they're sitting, right, next to you. One image is hitting their retina, and another image from somebody 300 yards away is also hitting their retina. Do they understand what they're looking at?
No.
No, they don't. They don't. And why did I pick age 52?
So that's the age of the guy in the book.
Because that's the age of the guy in the book. Just happens to be 52 years old. Right? So what happened to him? Okay. Here he lives for 52 years without sight. Long time to live without sight. And this case, right, very famous case in psychology. Now this guy, he was pretty independent. He had a pretty active life. Certainly, it's not going to be the life that you know, but this guy got out, he had a job, he had friends, and he had a small apartment. Again, it's not going to be the life that you know. But he was very high functioning. 52, right? Then all of a sudden, an operation gives him sight at age 52. A dream come true, right? And what happens to him, actually?
He just seems more confused than before.
He was overwhelmed, actually, by the world. His whole world. I mean, it's not very different than what we're looking at right here. Cultural assumptions and individual experience. I mean, this guy's experience is going to determine what he sees. Right? And this guy who's been blind since birth. So obviously, he comes to know the world by using his other senses. What are faces, what are colors, what are shapes, what's everything. And when he opens his eyes, okay, first of all, when he was in the hospital, he looks out the hospital window. What happened?
He tried to climb out.
Tried to climb out the window. Do you remember why?
He saw the traffic.
Saw
and
traffic on the
wanted
street.
to see what was going on
Yeah,
and didn't
he-
realize he was 4 stories up.
He didn't know that he was 4 stories up because distance and depth meant absolutely nothing to him. He couldn't see it. He couldn't see what you see. Did not understand what he was looking at all. Had no clue. Right, so he had to be restrained. He had to be pulled in. Now, so here's this guy. You know, I'll tell you, you know, the case is so famous because it tells us things that people don't, right? Yeah, you just sort of, you know, patch the guy up and send him out there on his way. Yeah? It's not that simple. Actually, the guy went into therapy for over a year. He couldn't go out of he didn't go out of his apartment anymore, gave up his job. He developed all kinds of fears about the world. I mean, what about traffic on the street? You know, cars coming by?
He was blind before and had made it so far, like 52 years. Being blind, not getting killed by cars, but he just can't handle the fact that now he can actually see them.
Well, what couldn't he handle?
The confusing messages. He
The
didn't
confusing-
know what he was looking at.
That's right. Okay? You see,
I wonder how often he closed his eyes.
I was just
get
going to
around.
ask. When he was overwhelmed about the world, what did he do? He closed his eyes. Once he closed his eyes, he was fine. He could calm himself down. When he opened his eyes, that was the problem because now he had no context. Right? The images that he had in his head and the visual images that were now coming in were not going together. They were not lining up. That was the primary problem.
He's relearning 52 years of assumptions.
That's right. He's relearning. Now, for some things, like he could look at things, and he learns what a clock is and certain things. And so he sees it. Even like 2 years later, it took him a long time to do this, by the way. 2 years later, he'd be looking at something, right, that he had seen numerous times. He couldn't identify it. He didn't know what it was until he, what? Huh? Touched it. He had to touch it. Here he's looking right at it. Even after he was learning about the world, he couldn't identify it. Once he touched it, he knew what it was immediately. This is a very simple illustration. Oh, wait a minute, before we look at this thing. You know, if we looked at every image that hits your retina on a daily basis, every single one, right? And we looked image by image by image, right, at every single one, there would be lots of disparities. I mean, the edges of rooms wouldn't always line up. Doors would not always look like they were squared off or rectangular. But there's a whole lot of disparities and discrepancies that we don't see. Right? Even though if we looked at every single image that hits your retina, we would see lots of inconsistency in the world. Inconsistencies that we don't ever notice. Why not?
I'm so used to that, just glaze over.
Why not? We perceive a very stable and very consistent world, despite the fact that there would be lots of inconsistencies. It's incredible how much we make the world conform or fit to what we think should be there. Something that we'll look at again. What we think should be. We fill in missing pieces. We do it all the time. We just don't recognize that we do it. Now this is a very simple illustration here. What are we looking at here? It's in your book. It's right from your book. What are we looking at? Tell me what this is. Yes?
They're like either a base thing or two people.
It's either one. What was the first thing you said?
A base thing.
Yeah, like a vase or right, or a chalice or so it could either be like a chalice or right, or a vase or a goblet, or the profiles of two faces. Yes? Two faces. Now, when you see the faces, right, the green part is in the foreground, and the yellow part would be in the background. And when you see the chalice, now the yellow part is in the foreground, and the green part moves to the background. The way in which this image is drawn, it's not clear to you which you should interpret as the foreground and which you should interpret as the background. And because that's not clear to you, they can change places. It's called, what's it called? No. It's called the reversible figure. Because the figured ground, right? Figured ground, meaning figure and background can change places. And if the figure and the background change places or reverse themselves, it changes what we see. Right? Very simple illustration. What's this? Circle. Is it?
It's a wide circle.
It's a bunch of dots that we have no problem connecting. It's easy for us to connect them. It's so familiar to us. The dots are in close enough proximity to one another that it makes it easy for us to connect them. Once they're connected, it becomes an identifiable figure. There were a group of psychologists studying perception. They came to be known as the Gestalt School. And if you remember what the word Gestalt means, you'll remember basically what they said. The word Gestalt actually means whole, as in the whole image. And the Gestalt psychologists came to argue that under certain conditions, human beings will connect things and perceive them as whole and connected. Whether they go together or not is not the issue. Under certain conditions, we will connect things in our minds and see them as going together. That we will merge them. Just like this. Right? Things that look alike, sound alike, are in close proximity to one another, right? We have a tendency to connect in our heads. Right? And that's what those basic principles of Gestalt organization are about. Similarity, continuity, nearness, proximity. Right? Those basic principles, that's what they argued, that things that are close together in time, space, that look alike, sound alike, we're going to have a tendency to connect. Now you have a page like this in your book as well. And if you have your book, look at this in your book, because it'll be much easier to see. See this thing right here? What's the figure that we have? Triangle. Again, if you have your book, look at it in your book. It's going to be much easier to see this. Now you see the triangle? Is the triangle the same color as the background? Same color?
No.
No?
It appears slightly lighter, but
Appears
it's not
li-
really.
Yeah, appears slightly lighter. Do you see the triangle up? Does the triangle look like it might be raised?
Feels like it's off the page a little bit.
Like maybe off a little bit, like maybe might be raised? You can see the boundaries of the triangle? Even though the color in the background's the same? You can see it though. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take 3 little fingers. Cover up these 3 figures right here. Just with 3 fingers. Now, if you cover up those little figures, what happens to the lines? They disappear. There's no lines, there's no boundaries, there's no shading, there's no raised, there's nothing. So now here's the question. You take your fingers off, and the triangle comes back. So is there a triangle there or not? Yes. There is no triangle there. How does the triangle get there? We put it in there. We do it all. Once we're given a limited amount of information, it's incredible what we will do with it. We fill in missing pieces. We do it all the time. We just don't realize how much we're doing it. Right? Once you're given a limited amount of information, that's all you need. You put in the rest. Because these three figures right here are very powerful visual cues for us. Those visual cues, right, we do the whole thing. But there are no lines, there's no boundaries, there's no shading, there's no raised, there's nothing. Nothing other than what we put there. We do it. We do it all. This is how a significant amount of visual illusions take place because somebody's playing around with your visual cues. Because our own, right? The things that we now know about the world and expect to see, we put them in. We put them all in. And it's even possible to take visual cues. It's like they can get spread out in an image. Sometimes they can even be contradictory. But visual cues are also operating over here. Right? Once we're given a limited amount of visual cues, right, the outline of the star is so distinct here because we even have a greater number of visual cues. But it's only the cues. It's only the cues that we're given. We do everything else once we have specific types of information. But that's how lots of magicians, illusionists, people trying to create an optical or visual illusion. Some artists are like masters at playing around with this stuff. In your textbook, on the next page, there's this. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to cover up the two bottom images and just look at the top one. Just look at the top image. And again, if you have your book, just do it in your book. Stare at the cube in your book. Stare at it. Keep looking. Keep looking. Keep looking. Blink. Did it change? Now, right? It's moving on the page. It's a magic cube, right? Just tell me why it's moving. Now, for some of you, it may have changed before I asked you to blink. For others, it changed when I asked you to blink. And for still others, it may not have changed at all. But I guarantee if you continue to look at this cube, it will change. So now, right, looks like the cube is moving. Like you're looking at the cube in two different ways. It's moving around. The cube is obviously now moving on the page. But it looks like it's moving on the page. You have what looks like a perfectly ordinary cube. Again, it all has to do with visual cues that we're being given. In this instance, contradictory sets of visual cues are being placed in the same image. So you got one set of lines in the cube that tells you to see the cube one way. So there's one set of lines, tells you how to see the cube. But these lines right here are contradicted by these lines. When you first look at it, you don't see any of this. It looks like a perfectly ordinary cube. But if you stare at it for a while, then all the information gets in. And all the information gets processed. And so now, the cube starts moving around. It all happens because of computers, and it all happens because of things that we're doing. Nothing's happening to it, obviously. Let's say that, look at this desk here. Now, this is a very familiar object to us. A desk, a table. I mean, everywhere we go, there are desks, there are tables, there are countertops. And we use them for any number of things. It's very familiar to us. Let's say that we took this object to a group of people who have never before seen anything like this. They have no desks, no tables, no chairs, no stools, benches, nothing. Nothing even remotely similar to this. And they have no words for any of those things either. Who would be able to use this object more creatively? Us or them?
They would, because we're more familiar with this, so we know what it's supposed to do and what it's supposed to be. They would find other ways to use it because they don't know what it is.
Because they don't know what it is, because they've never seen it before, they would be able to use this object a whole lot more creatively than us. So our familiarity with it, the fact that we see it and know it in a particular way, prevents us from seeing it differently or thinking about it differently. What's that called? What is that called?
Perceptual hypothesis.
No? A perceptual habit. It's a habit. An habitual way of seeing something. The way you see it, the way in which we perceive something is instrumental in how we think about it. Seeing it and thinking about it become connected. The way I see it, that's the way I now know it. Think about it. And it also shapes what we do with it, right? Our behavior. That's certainly true in the world of objects, yes?
I would argue there's some exceptions.
Well, let's not think about the exception. Okay? I'll ask you what they are in a moment. Which brings us back to the habitual way of seeing anything around us. like what? A doorknob. I actually used to go into class, ask people to take out a sheet of paper. I don't do that anymore. I'd say, okay, we'll do something different today. Take out a sheet of paper. 2,000 words on the following topic. All right. What's the topic? Doorknob. It's stupid, whatever. Nothing to write. I don't have anything to write, but it's not an English class. Why do I have to write this in this class? Right? I don't have anything to say. Boring, right? You know what it is? People, have difficulty with it because what could be more familiar than a doorknob? Because we're so familiar with it, because we have such a patterned and habitual way of thinking about it, it's like, who could possibly write 2,000 words on doorknob? There's nothing to say about a doorknob. It's just there. Right? It's habitual. Okay? In order to do this, in order to make this happen, you should be doing this in your English classes, really, about doorknob and countless other things. Because it challenges the way we ordinarily see and think. The only way you can do this is to step out of your habitual way of seeing and thinking. That's the only way you can do this. Because if you're stuck with that very limited way of seeing and thinking, right, what are you going to say? A doorknob opens a door, right? But if you move outside of it, doorknobs can open doors that go where? Anywhere. Into different worlds, into different universes, with different sets of laws, rules, beings, anything. And, right? You can open other doors that go into still other worlds. Or you could write it on, right? Different types of doorknobs, how doorknobs change throughout the years, right? Anything. The mechanics of the doorknob, but you'd have to have some knowledge of that.
Does the doorknob have to stay on the door?
Doorknob does not have to stay on the door. Doorknob can come off the door.
So
As a matter of fact, the doorknob could actually have a mouth and talk, right? A doorknob could say, hey, what do you think? It's easy being a doorknob? Right? You know how many hands touch me during the day? Big hands, little hands, fat hands, sweaty hands. Hands that play with me, fondle me, caress me. Don't make me feel good. Doorknob could do anything you want it to do. Right? The doorknob does not have to stay in one place. Right? So, in order to do this, you've got to come out of the habituated way of seeing and thinking and learn to look at it, right, differently. Right? That's why, in an example like this, who could use this more creatively or think about it more creatively? Right? People who have little or no experience and don't know what it is will not only see it differently, right? They will think about it and use it differently. These things go together, though, right? The way we see it, the way we think about it, and ultimately what we do, right? And with something like a doorknob, right, not only the way we see it and think about it, but what we do with it, right, reinforces how we see and how we think. They all go together. All right, so it's true in the world of objects. Is it true anywhere else? Yes. Like how?
Well, that's changing how we are perceiving our own world, so everybody is going to be perceiving it differently. Depending on how you are turning your sensations into...
Well, all right. Is there a connection between the way you see someone and the way you treat that person? And if the way you see that individual changes, doesn't it change the way you treat him or her? Let's take an example.